Welcome back to my LinkedIn Live series. It's been a while since I've hosted a series of live conversations, but I'm excited that we're launching season 5. This season is entitled Making It Golden, Building Trust with Responsible Generative AI. The episodes will focus on how generative AI is changing the financial services industry. For episode 1, I'm excited to welcome Raj Madan, Chief Digital and Technology Officer at Acutus Biotherapeutics. Raj has over 20 years of digital transformation and innovation experience. Prior to joining Acutus, he's worked with GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, and L'Oreal. Raj holds a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from the New Jersey Institute of Technology and a master's degree in both business administration and information services from New York University Stern School of Business. Raj, thank you for joining this series.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, Scott, and good to see you again.
Well, thank you. A lot's changed in the world of generative AI, since ChatGPT and other large language models were launched. We've seen DeepSeek, recently burst onto the scene with much more efficient applications of language models. And, I always really thought it'd be interesting for us to talk a little about how other industries, in particular biotech, are operationalizing generative AI and how the spectrum has been evolving and why. So maybe you could start us off with a little bit of introduction to yourself and the firm, but also what do you see in terms of adoption of generative AI and AI in general in your field?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, a little bit about myself. I've been at sort of this intersection of digital data and analytics, technology and AI now for, about 24, 25 years. Spent the last sort of 10 to 11 years in the pharma industry. Currently work for a small to mid-sized biotech, industry. We're exclusively focused in the medical dermatology space. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about AI, thinking about the applicability of AI. And before I sort of answer your question specifically, I was listening to a Simon Sinek podcast yesterday. I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek. He was on The Diary of a CEO. Stephen Bartlett sort of runs this podcast. And I think there were some interesting sort of takeaways that I wanted to sort of share, based on what sort of Simon said. I think one that sort of left me quite reflective, let's say, was that while AI and generative AI sort of specifically can sort of tell us how to do certain things, it's not going to do it for us. So, a lot of people are now using generative AI to sort of get therapy advice, let's say, and how to improve their relationships with their significant others, with their spouses, with their partners, with their parents, with their children. But what sort of generative AI does is it's going to tell you, okay, here are the steps that you can take to sort of improve those relationships, but it's not going to execute on those steps for you. So there's something about sort of, the ability of a human to sort of go in and actually learn from executing those steps. And I think that's where sort of growth happens, development happens for us as sort of humans. So, that was quite a reflective comment from Simon, which is sort of, even though ChatGPT or some of these other models are going to tell you what to do, unless you sort of actually go through the experience of doing it, you're not going to learn. And I think that sort of left me, thinking about, how I sort of use ChatGPT or I don't.
Yeah. Raj, I love the comment, and I think it's a great way for us to kind of kick off because, recently I just came from FICO world, and a comment was made that, we often talk about, human in the loop, right?
Yeah.
And the comment was made by my colleague at Forrester that said, well, actually, it should be AI in the loop, which really puts, as a tool for the human versus the human, following along the AI. So I absolutely agree with your feedback, that Simon provided. I think it's a good way to think about AI for sure, as enabling as a tool, not as something that will get it done for us necessarily all the way through.
Yeah, and one of the other things he said, which was sort of interesting, is I think we measure sort of these AI models on their level of hallucination. I mean, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, some of the other ones, we're sort of, trying to get them as close to perfect as possible. And, we want their current hallucination rates are less than 5% today. But, as humans, we have an imperfection rate of a lot more than sort of 5%, let's say, right? So, and the fact that we're imperfect as humans actually makes us, establishes this sort of human connection, let's say, and we connect with individuals because they are imperfect. I tend to connect more with people that are imperfect because I'm, imperfect to begin with. And the fact that sort of a chat GPT model is being driven to be more and more perfect is sort of a paradox in and of itself, right? So, humans are imperfect, but we want these models to be more and more perfect. And I think that's an interesting sort of paradox for us to wrestle with as well.
I agree.
Yeah. Cool. So maybe, Scott, I'll go back to your sort of question around, how is sort of biotech thinking about, generative AI and sort of operationalizing generative AI? And I think that for me, one of the big sort of aha moments when I entered sort of the pharmaceutical or the biotech industry was really around how long it takes us to sort of do drug development and drug discovery. So people that are not in the biotech industry might not know this, but it takes us about sort of 8 to 10 years, if we're lucky, to sort of take a drug from ideation, get it through sort of clinical trials, and then ultimately sort of get it into a commercial state. So that's an 8 to 10 year process, and the failure rate of that process is about 90%. So one of the areas that sort of AI is being really helpful, and this sort of even started before the whole generative AI sort of craze came around, was to help us accelerate sort of drug discovery and drug development, and really help us make sure that the drugs that we're developing and discovering, let's say, have a really high sort of success rate. So then we only sort of take those drugs through, the life cycle. Yes, it might still take us sort of 8 to 10 years, and I'll talk about how that's even getting shortened. But then ultimately, the success rate of those drugs actually getting out into a commercial state, impacting sort of patients with positive outcomes goes up. And I think that's a big sort of way in which AI is being used in sort of the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry. There's other sort of uses of AI that I can think about, which is, we spend about 6 to 9 months, biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies, to really prepare what's called sort of a regulatory filing. So this is when a drug has to go, has to get approved by the FDA, let's say. In the US, there's other sort of regulatory bodies, other places in the world. And to prepare that filing, 30 people sort of have to come together, coalesce all of this sort of information, and then that filing goes to the FDA. And that's an extremely sort of manual process today. So sort of using AI to really streamline that regulatory filing, let's say, is another sort of big opportunity that we think about. And then I would say that, there's a lot of sort of scientific literature that's put together. There's articles that are put together in sort of medical journals, let's say. Typically sort of medical affairs teams sort of do this, and they do this to sort of help explain the scientific benefits of drugs that are being worked on, that have been commercialized. And I think using AI to sort of enhance the development of those scientific publications is another sort of huge opportunity that I see in this space.
Got it. And, you're absolutely right to remind everyone that, like, drug discovery and deep models and these large models have been in play for quite some time from a drug discovery perspective, and looking at all the sort of combinations of what may work and may not work. Just curious, I mean, like, do you see uniform adoption within, firms, or do you see some firms that are like saying, listen, we're okay with traditional deep model, but not a generative AI model, or is it all in?
Yeah, look, I think that for me, it sort of depends sort of use case by use case. I don't think it's all in, let's say. I think there are certain models that work better for certain use cases. And there's other models that work better for other use cases, let's say. And I think, whether you're using sort of traditional AI or, or you're using sort of generative AI, I think it's all going to depend on sort of what the use case is and which model sort of works best for that use case. And in certain cases, I've also sort of seen the use of different models if you sort of break the use case up into sub-use cases, let's say. So even if you talk about this sort of drug discovery, drug development use case, let's say, part of the challenge with sort of using AI for drug discovery and drug development is that you have to curate a lot of different disparate sort of data sets that are not easy to connect. And previously, you sort of needed these unicorn resources that sort of understood the scientific dimensions of data, and they had sort of a data background as well. So they had this sort of scientific and data sort of expertise, and they were able to sort of bring that together. And they were able to sort of curate these data sets before the data sets were even ready for sort of AI models to act on. Now, you can use generative AI to actually coalesce these data sets, curate these data sets, but then use more of a traditional sort of AI model, and it could even be a machine learning model, like a neural net, for instance, that actually helps you understand whether this drug is going to work, not work, what the efficacy profile, what the safety profile, of that drug is potentially going to be once you sort of get it out in the wild, right? So I think there's, sometimes, what companies are doing is they're sort of thinking about a bit broader use case, sort of dividing that up into sort of sub problems. And then there's sort of different models, whether it's a generative AI model or a traditional AI model, that are being used across those sort of sub problem statements or sub use cases.
Yeah. And, I think maybe this is the industry is just kind of getting more mature, right? Like I think the more and more I'm seeing is generative AI is, I put out predictions earlier this year, and I said not all AI is generative AI, right? Just to make a point that most AI is not generative AI, and treating generative AI as one of the tools in the toolbox, of which there are many, to solve problems, I think is the right mentality. And so I'm hoping, right, as we get through the rest of this year, that generative AI will no longer be a phenomenon, but it will be, one of many different tools that get used in solving problems. And I think that's the right way to look at it, right? There's lots of different things that have to be brought together.
Yeah. And, I think, Scott, just one sort of comment I would add on that is I think you're absolutely right. I think there's different tools in the toolbox. I think you got machine learning, you got sort of more traditional AI, you got generative AI, now you got sort of AI agents, let's say. And I think one thing I find sort of funny and maybe fascinating is that, I've seen certain vendors that, almost sort of go with the hype or with the flavor of the day, right? So today they call themselves sort of machine learning vendors. Last year they called themselves generative AI vendors. This year they're calling themselves, agentic AI vendors. And I think that's interesting. I think just watching some of these vendors sort of market themselves based on, the latest trend that's out there. I sort of take that with a grain of salt, right? I mean, there's so many vendors out there. There's so many startups out there. I think, just sort of understanding the differences between the various tools in the toolbox and making sure that you clearly understand, if you're partnering with a vendor, which tool are they actually using, and then which tool are they selling you on that they're sort of, want you to think that they're using. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, for sure. What's marketed versus what is really used, two very different things sometimes. And you got to dive in. You're talking about diving in, right? And you mentioned earlier, like the LLMs have this reputation for hallucination, right? And that I used to talk about that a lot, primarily in reaction to like this overwhelming sort of, fascination with the technology. And I eventually got to a point where I was comfortable with that concept because, as we all know, all models are wrong, right? So we shouldn't hold, I think you just said that about humans too, right? We can't hold a generative AI to a standard that no other AI model could meet either, right? It makes mistakes, it has false positives. But I was curious, in the pharmaceutical area, and biotech in general, right? How's hallucinations viewed? I mean, is it viewed as, hey, models will be wrong, and that's part of using a model? Is it used as some sort of insight that can be, garnered and maybe like a creative sort of intern or mark contributor? What's the philosophy there around hallucination, or is it just an error rate that we all deal with as we use this technology?
Yeah, so Scott, I would say that, look, I think in the pharma biotech industry, we're dealing with patient lives. And that's important. I mean, so I would say that we have a extremely low tolerance for hallucination rates, right? So, just making sure that, any model that we use for whatever sort of task we're using it for, we want to reduce the hallucination rate pretty much down to zero. I think, yeah, you're sort of dealing with, patient lives here. So I think, and I think that's where sort of the human in the flow concept, I think, becomes really important, right? So, thinking of these models as sort of a starting point, but and sort of a way in which they can enable a specific workflow, let's say, is the way we sort of have to think about it. It's not the end all, it's not the be all, and it's probably never going to be the end all or the be all, but it sort of gets you to an interesting sort of starting point. And then, I think the human still has to come back in the loop and make sure that, the outputs of these models are validated. Um, and I think this doesn't even apply to only the pharma industry, but I think just sort of generally speaking, I think just making sure that you think about the explainability of your models, and you think about removing biases in your models as well, right? I mean, when you're in the pharma industry, when you're running sort of clinical trials, you want to make sure that you have an extremely diverse set of patients that you're running those clinical trials on. That way you can sort of understand how your drug does across different diverse populations. And I think models that are built without sort of enough diversity of training data, further increases the hallucination rate of that model. So I think it's really important to train these models with the right data sets, with the right training sets, make sure that they're explainable. But I think the sort of old adage that says, trust and verify. I think in the pharma industry, when you think of sort of the use of AI, it's do not trust and verify, let's say. So I think you really have to make sure that any output from any model that impacts patient lives is not trusted to begin with. It's a starting point, and then from that point on, you have to make sure that you continue to validate that model and have a human in the loop.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up and emphasized just how important the use of AI is, and what conclusions we get from it in your area. And in fact, I'll be at Money 2020 next week, and I'm giving a presentation around auditable AI. Right, this is essentially, what is the model development standard? What are the checks and balances? What technology can you use or not use? And what sort of monitoring's in place? And the concept of like persisting that to a blockchain is just to demonstrate like the seriousness of like following those steps and having those checks and balances. So I couldn't agree more. I think it's a fundamental part of responsible AI is for each domain, right? Focusing on how far do we go? What's our comfort level? But what are those verifications? What are those monitorings that we have to do so that we can decide what we use? And sometimes, right, like not some of these technologies are less explainable or less interpretable, and we choose a different technology where there's a high impact. So no, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I've been focused on recently, Raj, and I think you've seen this, right, is I've been talking about, when it comes to these sort of leveraging generative AI models, and specifically these concepts of transformer models, right, to really use this concept of focused language models, right, like really focusing in on, not trying to adapt or fine tune a model that you have no control over on how it was built, and you have no control of the data that we used, and potentially bias. And you brought that up in terms of understanding the data and what have you. And basically, building these models from scratch, right? These small language models, right? They're very focused purpose. I was just curious, are you seeing that concept take hold in biotech? Is that a popular sort of concept to build those models specifically for those tasks or on that data versus fine tuning or adapting a larger, more generic model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're definitely starting to see that sort of happen. And what I would say is that one of the biggest concerns, and Scott, this is not unlike maybe the financial services space as well, which is some of the data that we hold, some of the data that we deal with is extremely sort of sensitive. There's, a lot of, regulation around some of the data sets that we have. And I think that, sort of the challenge with large language models, as great as, as they are, is that there's, I think sort of the whole data privacy, data security thing is a big question mark for me. I think some models, will sort of tell you that they don't use your data to sort of train the model, but then the language, sort of the legalese is not clear. So you really don't know whether they're sort of using your data to further train the model or not. And I think the other sort of thing about large language models is that they sort of tend to be generalist in nature, right? So they're looking at a fairly significant volume of data, and then they're using that to sort of come to some sort of an inference for you. Whereas I think with sort of small language models, I think, dealing with sort of data privacy becomes a little bit easier because you can build sort of small language models for a specific use case. And then the specificity of, of that model sort of goes up, right? So I sort of use this notion of sort of, are you looking for a specialist or are you looking for a generalist, right? And I think if you're looking for a specialist and there's a specific sort of expert-driven task that you're looking for the model to do, then I think a small language model makes more sense. If you're looking for more sort of generalist sort of inferences and expertise, let's say, then I think a LLM makes more sense, right? So I think, that's the question you sort of have to ask yourself. And, so that's sort of the framework that I use. Is it a specialist? Is it a generalist? And I think either model works depending on what you're looking to do.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that up, right? And yeah, a specialist in a particular area, and then, you have regulatory concerns, data concerns, or just, a hyper need for tremendous accuracy, right? And, very often you find that when you use a focused approach with very specialized data and a small language model, that it can certainly outperform, right, the more generalist models, and that tends to make a lot of sense, right, in both pharma, but also areas like financial services where accuracy matters, and it turns into like the right treatment for customers. So I agree with that. I think everyone should be thinking in that fashion and not trying to take a generalist and allowing it to be expert in every field.
Mm-hmm.
But this kind of parlays into another question, right, which is, AI literacy, right? It's interesting. I'm getting more and more conversations that we should be talking about AI at the middle school level and high school level, and our society's not quite prepared for this, right? We're all aware of AI and people have opinions about it, but I was just curious, what does AI literacy mean in the biotech context, and what does that look like within your teams and within the industry?
Yeah, I think what that looks for us, I think it starts with just getting everyone to sort of understand the capabilities that generative AI can provide, but I think more importantly, the limitations of generative AI, right? So, that these models are going to have a level of hallucinations. They're going to have some level of data leakage. They're going to have biases sort of built into them. And I think also, so I think there is sort of a big balance in how you think about AI literacy is really about sort of explaining sort of the capabilities and the benefits of it, but also sort of, I think, making sure that the risks, whether it's around hallucinations, data leakage, biases, data privacy, let's say, data security, all of that is sort of well understood. So I think that's really important to sort of strike that balance from a literacy perspective. I think the other thing that, for me has been a big sort of aha moment is when I first started to use sort of ChatGPT or generative AI, I sort of use it a little bit like a search engine. And I think it's not meant to be used as, it could be used as sort of a search engine. But I think what's interesting about sort of generative AI, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever it is that it's a very iterative process. So whereas with a search engine, you sort of put a search query in and you sort of expect that the answer will come back, and you sort of look at sort of a set of answers, you pick one and you sort of solve your, your sort of search query this way. Whereas with generative AI, it's meant to be sort of a back and forth process. It's meant to be a very iterative process. And I think that in and of itself, I think is a very sort of different skill to acquire, because you can prompt it and then it'll come back with an answer, and then sort of ask it to refine its answer based on sort of an update to the prompt, let's say, or giving it a new prompt, or whatever it is. So I think that's really important, where I think the way individuals sort of interact with sort of generative AI, in my opinion, is very different than sort of how you interact with sort of a search engine. And I think that there's a little bit of learning that individuals have to go through. I've been through that sort of learning, and I think that sort of process of it, iteration and sort of helping individuals understand that is really important.
I think it's important, and it's interesting. Each flavor of these different models, right? They have different incentives, right? And in some sense, right? Sometimes, that prompting or that sort of iteration could lead to a model that wants to, please me, right? Whereas maybe I should be pleased, right? And so like there's a lot of sort of expertise in that dialogue, but also, I think you brought it up earlier, like how human or not human do we want these sort of interactions to look like? Because in some sense, right, there's lots of ways to guide the answer to be what you need it to be or what you want it to be. And so I think there's a lot there in terms of what that interaction looks like, both positive and potentially negative, right? Depending on, your skill or your ability to sort of, allow that feedback to come back and don't really adulterate it, right? With sort of additional information that would sway an outcome, right? And I think there's a lot to be done here, actually, from an auditing perspective in terms of how decisions get made as those interactions come in. I think it's a fascinating area of research, actually. But what do you think about, like, as people start to use these? Have you heard surfaces of concerns from employees or others as they started to use generative AI, or do you think their interaction is more like just still in this sort of awe moment? Or are they seeing like, hey, if I ask it 3 different ways with different tones or different sort of emphases, I get different answers, and maybe that's bad for the business? I'm just curious if there have been any fears or concerns that employees have shared with you in terms of their journeys with generative AI.
Yeah, look, Scott, I think the biggest sort of question we get from employees is, what does this mean for sort of, job security? Are we entering a world where, where sort of, our jobs are going to be eliminated, our roles are going to be sort of eliminated, let's say? And my sort of answer to that is, I don't see sort of AI as a big sort of role, eliminator. I see AI as a role enhancer, and I think using it as a way to support the kinds of things that you're doing, and I think empowering sort of team members to sort of think about AI as it's supplementary. It helps you sort of accelerate your job. It helps you sort of gain incremental productivity, let's say. I think that's the context in which I sort of think of sort of job security, let's say. There is going to be a little bit of sort of role redefinition, and I think we all have to sort of prepare for that, which is, look, I think the best example I use is that we're probably going to have less authors and we're probably going to have more editors, right? So, authors are going to transition into becoming more editors, but it doesn't mean that, this sort of, everything is now going to be written and edited by AI. I think the human still has to be in the loop, right? So I think, we have to think about sort of how our roles get redefined, how our roles get evolved. But I'm not overly sort of concerned that there's going to be a mass, there's going to be sort of a big surge in, resource supply, and there's not going to be enough sort of resource demand. I'm not seeing that. I think there's going to be a little bit of a recalibration that we're going to have to go through. And, I think individuals are going to have to sort of, evolve their roles, let's say, like the author and the editor piece. But I think beyond that, this isn't sort of a, I sort of see AI as sort of an enhancer, a sort of a tool in a toolbox that sort of helps you evolve your job, improve your productivity, and drive more optimization for you and your company.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be scary with some of the quotes out there about 25% reductions in workforces and a completely AI workforce. But going back to a comment I made about my friend Brendan Purcell at Forrester, who said we should really think about this as AI in the loop, right? Yeah, re-envisioning jobs where AI becomes more accessible as a tool, right, to allow us to be superhuman is really the way that I think companies will tremendously succeed, right? Versus a replacement of workforce. But that'll take time and better tools, right? Better AI tools, which is what we're all focused on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Raj, I think we're at the end of time. I really want to thank you for being part of this conversation, giving us insight to many of my views here that don't generally hear from other industries. I think it's really important to hear. So I appreciate you sharing all those insights, Raj.
No, absolutely. Happy to be on here, Scott, and good to see you again.
Great seeing you. And for everyone else, make sure you tune into my next LinkedIn Live conversation in this series. We'll have Wei Chen, Managing Director and Head of Credit Strategy and Analytics at Barclays, U.S. Consumer Bank, here with us on June 12th. We'll continue the conversation around how we're leveraging generative AI in responsible ways and ways that really makes our age golden. Thank you so much.